Welcome to the Radical Lifestyle Podcast, brought to you by Generation to Generation, where you will be inspired by the past, equipped for the present, and prepared for the future as we engage in conversations with people from around the world. Hello everyone, this is Andrew and Daphne from Generation to Generation, and our guest today is Andrew Brunson. Now Andrew, for people that don't know who you are, can you just say a bit about where you're from and what you do?
Well, the reason anybody would know my name is because maybe they prayed for me or heard some stories of my imprisonment in Turkey. But my wife and I were American, and we were in Turkey for 25 years, 23 years of those by choice, and 2 of them by force. And during our 23 years of free ministry, we were involved in some church plants, starting a house of prayer, and also working with Syrian refugees when the civil war in Syria heated up. And after that, 2 years in prison for me, and many people began to pray for me around the world. So that would be, if there's any name recognition, it would come from that.
And now, I know you've got a book, but for people that want to find out more about you, maybe get your book, where can they do that?
You mean the book, where they can get the book?
Yeah, or find out more about you if you've got places where you do teachings or whatever.
Yeah, so the book is out there wherever, people buy books. It's called God's Hostage. And I'm really not trying to plug the book, but it is available easily. As for where they can catch up with us, I'm sure there's some videos out on YouTube of meetings that we've done. Our ministry is called Wave Starters, wavestarters.org. And so there is a web page. I wouldn't call it a website because that would be too glorified a description. It's really just a page, and it has some information. But the truth is that we are still working in missions, and we're still focused in the Muslim world. So that means that we don't really talk a lot about that kind of work.
Yeah. Now, we want to get on to your time in Turkey, but can we go back before that? Growing up, what was it like growing up? Did you grow up in a Christian family? Did they have a heart for missions? How did you get a heart for missions? Can you just give us some of that information?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian home. In fact, my parents were missionaries. So I was brought up in Mexico. My wife is also a missionary kid. Her parents, her father produced Hungarian radio programs that were broadcast into Hungary during the communist period. And so we both come from mission families. As I said, I grew up in Mexico. My mother she had 7 children, my mom and dad, and she wanted all of them to go into missions. That was really her passion. And most of them didn't. I'm the only one who did. And my calling to missions, so obviously it didn't come just from how my mother shaped me, although she really did shape me considerably. But when Hudson Taylor was a well-known missionary to China in the 1800s, early 1900s, when he was an old man, a woman took her 2 children to him and said, I want you to lay hands on them and set them aside for missions. And so Hudson Taylor did that. He laid hands on them, prayed for them, set them aside. And those 2 boys, when they grew up, became missionaries. One of them, Stanley Solto was his name, was a missionary in Korea. And when he was an old man, shortly before he died, my mother took me and my younger sister to him and said, what Hudson Taylor did for you, I want you to do for my children. And so he laid hands on us and set us aside for missions in the same way he had been set aside. And I remember that, I won't say I remember it clearly, but it's probably my earliest memory, because right after that, he prayed for us. I got a spanking because I had not been cooperating and I'd been acting up. So they spanked me, and that kind of engraved that day into my mind. And so I have this memory of him praying for me. And I believe that God did something that day that he just put into deep into my identity that I had a calling for missions, and I believe God set me aside for it. So even during my teen years, I went through a period when I was definitely not walking with God. But if someone were to ask me, what are you going to do, when you're older, my answer would be, if I survive this period of my life, I know that I'm supposed to be a missionary. I'm not even walking with God, but I know this is my calling. And so that's what I think happened. God set me aside for this, and he opened the doors for me to do it.
Mm.
Wow.
And how did you come to the point where you knew it was Turkey?
Well, my wife and I were reluctant missionaries to Turkey. We did not want to go there. The group we were with at the time, the denomination I was in, that I had grown up with, they said, we're sending a team to Turkey and we want you to go there. We were actually wanting to go to the Arab world. We were headed toward Egypt. And everything was arranged for us to go there. And then they suddenly sprung this on us and said, we don't want to go to Turkey. We put before the Lord, we said, Lord, if you want us to go to Egypt, show us clearly, and we will go there, whatever our group wants. But if you don't say anything, then we will go to Turkey and just basically submit to what they are asking. And we didn't hear anything directly from God, so by default, we went to Turkey. When we got on the plane to fly there for the first time from the States, Noreen was crying, my wife. It's like, my life is over. I don't want to go there. But so we started out at bottom level. We didn't want to be there. And then over the first few years, God just put something into our hearts. And this is where I say a love for the Turkish people that is not an idealized or romanticized love for the culture, the food, or things like that. It was not so much an emotional thing as love expressed in a commitment to see God's blessing, to see God's kingdom come to that people. And that took us through a number of difficulties where actually what really helped was that we believed God had assigned us to this place. Whether we felt like it or not, whether we really enjoyed it or not, this is an assignment from God. And that meant that when difficulties came up that often they could have knocked us out, then we kind of pressed through them because it was a matter of obedience and commitment. And that helped a great deal because there were a number of hardships over the years.
Yeah.
So often these things get romanticized from afar. I'm going to go and serve in this nation. I'm going to go and, be this great missionary and win the world for Jesus. And you hear that romanticized, but when you pull it back, there is that path of obedience that you walk through no matter what. And I think, as you know, God is looking for faithfulness. And I think sometimes it's good just to pull the curtain back and say, actually, we just did this because we knew we walked in obedience to do it.
And over time, I have to say, our hearts really did become tied to the place. And we have many dear friends there that we really miss. But, there's something that happened when we were first arrested. We were, my wife and I were being held in a detention center, and it was the first night. And, we had been called into the local police station. We went in and we thought we were going to pick up our long-term residence permits that would let us remain there for the rest of our lives. And instead we hear, there's an order to deport you as a threat to national security. And so we're going to arrest you and hold you for deportation. And our world just came crashing down because we were building ministries. We were encouraged about some of the things that we're developing. And I thought I had an assignment from God to prepare for harvest. And I'm saying, what happened? This isn't possible. How can we prepare for harvest in Turkey if you kick us out of the country? And so we're really shaken. And just before our phones were taken away and we were locked up, someone had sent us a message that said, go with thanksgiving. And so we tried to do this. We didn't know what was actually ahead of us, this terrible ordeal, but we tried to intentionally say, okay, we want to go praising you, thanking you, God. So started to think of all these things that had been accomplished in the 23 years up until that point. And we'd say, well, look at what happened with Mustafa, for example. Thank you, God, for his life. And then I start to think of all the difficulties we'd had with Mustafa, for example. Or look, the house of prayer was started. And that's wonderful. And thank you, God. And then I'd start to think of all the difficult things we went through and setting them up and the price we paid, because every time we started a ministry, we paid a significant personal price. And in some way, physically, or, in our ministry or in our family, financially, we'd get hit. And I realized it was almost like a grace had lifted. Like God had given us a grace to keep plugging on. And now that was not required any longer. And that grace was removed. And I started to see all of the difficulties. So this is just responding to what you said. There are many wonderful things, very fulfilling in ministry, but there are also many, many struggles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before you'd gone to Turkey, had you been out to the Middle East much already? Had you been out to some of these persecuted nations, spent time in those beforehand, or was this kind of your first excursion into that kind of area?
Excursion. I don't know about excursion. Go for it.
We didn't have a lot of exposure. As I said, I grew up in Mexico, and when Noreen married me, she knew that meant going back to Mexico as missionaries. And then we spent a year with Operation Mobilization in London at their headquarters. And during that year, we saw a number of teams going out into Muslim countries. And God, independently of each other, put in each of our hearts just a growing conviction that that's what we were to do. And so it was that year that things changed. And then we said, okay, God wants us to go to the Muslim world. And you have to be, surely it has to be something from God, I think, because otherwise to want to work in a Muslim country, I mean, it's difficult, it's very slow progress. And so I think God really put that in our hearts. So we did not have a lot of exposure or experience in the Muslim world before.
Okay. And so I had seen a conversation you'd had with someone else, and you'd mentioned in it, you hadn't really prepared yourself for what was about to happen, the possibility of it, and that it was a problem because you hadn't prepared yourself. Can you talk a bit about that, and what would it, looking back, what would it look like to have prepared yourself? How might you have done it?
So remind me of the entirety of this question, because I tend to go off in different directions. So first is that I do emphasize now preparing to stand, and that's one of the things that one of our ministry assignments now, I think from the Lord, because I broke in prison my first year, especially in a number of ways, and we can go into that later if you want. But I think one of the reasons God allowed me to break in the way I did so thoroughly and so often was that I learned how to do things that would strengthen my heart so that I could stand under the pressure. And I think these things are transferable. Now, I think for people in persecuted countries or contexts, and I think in the West, there's going to be rising pressure. It will be different than people face in the Muslim world. I don't expect, for example, many people in the United States necessarily to go to prison for their beliefs, but I think that there will be increasing social and financial pressure on believers. And most people in the West are not ready for it. They don't expect it. And so I think one of the things God was preparing me for is to learn some of these mindsets and disciplines and focus points that would help me to stand so that I can prepare other people to stand. So yes, there are things we can do ahead of time to prepare ourselves. I think what you're referring to when I said I wasn't ready is that So let me first say that we had counted the cost for some things. Anybody who's involved in a public, high-profile ministry the way we were in Turkey. So we were involved in maybe 6 different church plants with the teams we worked with, and involved in more than that actually, but they didn't all take root. But about 6 that took some form of root, and anybody who's involved in that kind of work is going to have death threats. We had bomb threats throughout the years. This happened a number of times. And one time I was also attacked by a gunman. I was shot at. So we had factored some of these things in as a possible cost, perhaps naively, but just we counted the cost for that. We also worked on the Syrian-Turkish border during, when there was a lot of conflict there, and there were risks. I could hear bombs going off and small arms fire and things like that. And for an American to be there was not the safest thing. So my point is that there was I would characterize or describe myself as a relatively tough missionary at that time. And so if someone had said to me, Andrew, you're going to spend some time in a Turkish prison, I probably would have been afraid, but I also would have had a sense of bravado. Bring it on. I can do this. Paul spent time in prison. Richard Wurmbrand spent time in prison. Other people who I admire, whose biographies I've read, have done this, and it'll be hard. I'm sure I'll feel grief and loneliness, but it's going to be a good time with God, and I would have had that. I'll have a sense of grace and strength and joy, and so the sense that I wasn't prepared or that I was malprepared, misprepared, was that my idealized view of suffering, well, it just didn't line up with what most people actually experience. So it was my reading of biographies, which perhaps don't tell the whole story sometimes, or else the people who have biographies written about them are just so amazingly strong that we don't really see the struggle. Maybe they didn't struggle a great deal, but I did. And so when I land in prison and I don't have a sense of strength, I don't have any joy, I don't have a sense of grace. And now as I look back, I can see there was grace, but it was an unfelt grace for the most part. So is this grace? Is this the entirety of grace? It does not feel like enough, because I broke, as I said. I broke physically. I lost about 50 pounds. Because of all the stress hormones break down the body's natural tranquilizer system and eventually overwhelms it. So I had wave after wave of panic attacks. And when you put panic together with basically hopelessness, that's a very dangerous combination. So I was suicidal during my first year. And one of the main reasons for this is because I went into spiritual crisis with God. Because what most shocked me was I lost all sense of God's presence. And I had run after God's presence for years. Since 2007, at least, we had begun to focus much more on running after God's heart, drawing close to Him, intimacy, and especially presence. And so to have that removed, I'm saying, God, where are you? I've taught about the Father heart of God. Where is my kind, gentle Father? Here I'm suffering for your sake, and where are you in the midst of it? I feel like I've been abandoned. And objectively, I can say I wasn't abandoned, but God removed He stripped me of all of any sense I'd ever had, any way in which I'd ever related to His love or faithfulness or His presence in the past. And so I think when I say I wasn't prepared, it was I didn't have a realistic view of what suffering could be like. And I thought I was the weakest person in the world when I was in prison. I was, I'm just broken. I'm so weak. And then when I got out and I started to learn about others who've been in prison for their faith, some Chinese, some North Koreans, I find out that my experience is actually more common than what we read about in the very victorious biographies, that there are many Chinese and North Koreans who actually break in prison. I've just heard about the ones who almost seem to love prison,
Yeah.
So one of the things I just underline is not to have an idealized, romanticized view of suffering, of persecution, because it's dangerous. And every time Jesus talks about persecution, there are warnings that go with it, because people break. We're weak.
So we've been, we read the Word together every morning, most mornings. And one of the things that's said repeatedly as we've been reading through the New Testament is we read these scriptures so carefully. He was beaten and stripped and thrown into the marketplace. He was flogged. And we read it like...
We just kind of glance over it.
And a few times I've said, haven't I, 1 minute, let's just stop and think about this. What was it like to be flogged and beaten and thrown into the marketplace, for example? And so, I don't understand what you're saying because I haven't been through it. I don't want to say it like that. But I think even reading scriptures, we can glamorize it and we can just glance over it like just a few words in a verse instead of stopping and thinking, what was this cost that was paid? One other thing that I'd say is I did a kind of, not a survey, that's too grand a word, but in many persecuted nations, I asked 2 questions, but one of them was, were you afraid? Because people, you have this view that they weren't afraid, they were doing it. And the time after time they said, yeah, we were terrified. We were terrified. But then they would say, but it's not the terror and the fear that's condemning. It's what you do with that fear and terror, whether you push through it or you cave into it. Would you agree with that?
So first, let me go back to something before, which is I talk about breaking. I don't want to have your listeners think that this is just a brokenness story, because really I was broken so that God could then rebuild me. And the second year was one of rebuilding, and that's what I like to focus on. But just so to encourage your listeners not to think, oh, this is just, it was a terrible thing and, disaster. It was very difficult, but God shepherded my heart and took me through. Now, on the subject of fear, I do talk about fear because I think what you said is true. I'm an expert on fear. I've had a lot of fear. And I think that, we read in the Bible so many times, do not fear, do not fear. And Jesus certainly emphasizes this. But I don't think that is talking so much about the emotion of fear, because our emotions respond to things. It's not something we plan. And I cannot avoid the faster heartbeat or the adrenaline rush that comes when there's a threat. Okay, I can't avoid it. But I think Jesus is not talking so much about fear as emotion, but fear as what you mentioned, making decisions according to fear, responding out of fear. And so we can be afraid and yet stand firm. And this is what soldiers do. They're trained to act against their instinct. The instinct is to run when you're afraid. And they go through a lot of training so that when there is a threat and they are afraid and that adrenaline is rushing and the heart's beating fast and they're afraid, so that they don't run but are disciplined and continue in the assignment that they have. So as believers, it's the same thing. Now, one of the things you mentioned, I think sometimes people have as I said, an idealized view of what persecution is and how people should respond. And Paul is often the example. So you use, I think it was Paul's example, be all kinds of things he went through, and yet he says this momentary light affliction is preparing for us a weight of glory beyond comparison. Because we look not at what is unseen as what is seen, but what is unseen, because what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And Paul was right about this, that what really matters is eternity. There's something so important, and this is, in the larger scheme of things, it's a very short temporary thing. However, when Paul said this, he wasn't saying it in faith. He was saying it out of experience. And this is something that I begged God for in prison. I said, look, Paul had this view, this eternal view, you could call it eternal eyes, or a kingdom mindset, partly because he had an experience, he had an encounter with the resurrected Jesus in all his glory, so much that it knocks him down and blinds him for a time. So powerful encounter that changes his life. And then he also went to heaven. Paul talks about going to heaven and hearing things, seeing things. And so when he says, guys, it can't compare, I'm willing to put up with all of these things here because they're so small compared to what God is going to give us and the glory we'll carry if we're faithful and all these things. He saw it. And I said, God, if you would let me have this experience, take me to heaven for 1 minute, or Jesus, appear in my cell and just in your glory. And if you did that, I'm sure that I would just shut up and stop complaining and have a different mindset. But he didn't give that to me. I asked for it so much. He didn't give it to me. And so I had to build, I think what counters this fear or acting out of fear is building a fear of God. Who am I going to fear more, God or man? Am I going to fear the consequences of obeying God with this persecution, or the consequences of not obeying God? And so we counter it with building a healthy fear of God, and also building this heavenly perspective, this kingdom perspective. And I had to do that, and I did do it. Early on, I started to ask God to put his fear in my heart. God says to Israel, I will put my fear in their heart so they do not depart from me. And I was questioning God's existence. And I was accusing his, accusing his character. I don't know if you're good, true, loving, just. All of these things. Faithful. I don't know if you're faithful, really, because I'm not seeing it. And I started to just ask God, put the fear of you in my heart. Build this in my heart. Build this kingdom perspective into my heart, so that I do remain faithful. And he did build it in me. So I can encourage your listeners and say, even if you don't have an encounter with God, which many people are not going to have that in their moment of crisis, you can still build through a discipline and turning your eyes repeatedly to heaven. And you can change your mentality so that you really do have a fear of God. And I mean, if you want, I can tell you one of the ways that I did that.
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah. And just reflecting back, I know that, we talk a lot with people as we travel, and the issue of persecution, especially as we see the way the world is going right now and the increasing pressures in the West. We used to look at people getting arrested and talk about it, and you would be talking about the Middle East, out in Asia. Well, now there are it's different reasons, but you are now seeing pastors getting arrested in Canada and Australia, and threats in America. And so it's starting to raise this issue in people's minds more and more. And people are terrified. And we'll often talk to them in these conversations, and they'll really struggle with the issue of persecution. What if that happens? What if it's me? How would I possibly stand? And most of the time when you read these books of these things, they are of how God miraculously worked through these situations and helped these people through. Your story is much more on the gritty side of really going through the hard times and having to work your way through that, which I think would be really helpful to people to be able to relate to this story and go, this is probably how I feel I would go through these situations. So how did Andrew manage to walk through this really difficult times? So I think it's really interesting for people to actually hear this kind of story.
So, yes, can you share that with us? I've forgotten what it was you were going to share, but I wanted to hear it.
One of the ways that I built eternal perspective or kingdom perspective, eternal lives, or is at about the 10-month mark of my imprisonment, I had I was called into a court session and told that basically they wanted to give me 3 life sentences in solitary confinement with no possibility of parole, plus 35 years on top of that. And so when I say I spent 2 years in prison, I did spend 2 years. If I'd known it was going to be 2 years, it would have been difficult enough, but I would have been counting the days down. But I didn't know that I'd ever get out. Until the actual day that I was released, I did not know I was going to be released. So it was very sudden. But up until then, I was living with the possibility that I would, spend the rest of my life in a Turkish prison and never be with my family again. So I was called into the court session. I just hear this devastating news, and I go back to my cell. And for a couple of weeks, I'm just really discouraged. But I start to fight again to, get back and to focus on God. And I was walking around just pacing and kind of crying out my emotions of grief, oh God, I'm just so, the sense of loss of my family, of my life. And what comes out of my mouth is, you are worthy, you're worthy of my all, you're worthy of whatever suffering I go through, which is kind of really not lining up with my emotions, but it's what's coming from my heart, you could say. So I just began to sing. It became a heart song. And I wrote it down. I didn't sit down to write a song. It's just what came. But one of the verses goes, I want to be found worthy to stand before you on that day, with no regrets from cowardice or things left undone. And this came from just having a picture in my mind of standing before Jesus at the end of my life and him saying to me, Andrew, I had assignments for you to accomplish and you didn't. You left them undone because you were a coward. And I had an inheritance for you to win, to gain in this earth, and you didn't because you ran away. And this took me back to a few months earlier when I was at a very low point. It was one of the biggest defeats I think I had in prison, was when I said to God, I said, I don't want to serve you anymore. I still want to be, your son. I'm not denying Jesus, but I don't want to serve you anymore. I'm suffering so much because I did serve you. And if you think that you're going to use this, if you intend to use my imprisonment in some way, I'm not wanting to cooperate with this. I'm finished. I'm broken. Just let me go. I'm willing to be the least in the kingdom of heaven. Just let me go back to my family. That's all I'm asking for. I don't want any more assignments from you. And this was a terrible defeat, actually. I'd been serving him for many years, and here I was saying, basically, I give up my inheritance. I don't care. I just can't handle this. And here, several months later, under worse conditions, when now I'm finding out 3 life sentences, doesn't get much worse than that, then I'm repenting and saying the opposite. I'm saying, no, I want every assignment you have for me. I want to finish it. Because that picture standing before Jesus, I started to live for that and say, I want to live for the day I stand before you. And not go through eternity with regrets. And I sang that every day for the rest of my time in prison. And it just started to build something in me where I'm focused. I get up and I say, I want to live for the day I stand before you. That's what I said this morning when I got up. I don't want to have regrets when I stand before you. I want to complete every assignment. I want to live for the day I stand before you and hear you say, well done, Andrew. I want you to know me for my love and my obedience and my devotion to you. And that's what I'm still living for, what I'm trying to live for. So that kind of changed my doing this day after day after day, began to build something in me. And this became my battle after that. I'd get up in the morning with the fear and the despair, and I'd start to fight to get to that point where I say, God, if my being in prison is what best serves your purposes, then I'm willing to stay here. I don't want to be here. I'm not strong enough. Give me the strength and courage so that I can endure and be faithful to the end, but I'm willing to serve your purposes. And I would get to that point eventually that day and have some measure of peace, not as much as you would expect, and then start over the next morning with the same fear and despair and fight again. And just pressing into that day after day, basically saying, I'm willing to suffer now so that I can be faithful to the assignments you have and live for eternity. It changed my mindset. And so this is something we can build. The question now, I don't think most people in the West are going to go to prison in the UK or in Canada or the US, but what is coming, I think, is a social and financial pressure, and being canceled. It can be said very lightly, but it has serious consequences. And I think of the isolation, the shaming, the silencing, the ostracizing. People may be losing their jobs, being looked down on by their social circle and being pushed aside, marginalized. Those things are very difficult. And many people, I think what we have to try to develop is, Jesus told his disciples, don't fear the ones who can basically destroy your body here. Rather fear him who can destroy both body and soul forever. And I think to apply that now would be, don't fear those who can cancel you in this life. Oh, it's difficult. It's a heavy burden. Rather fear the one who can cancel you for eternity. We need to begin to develop that fear of God and that those eternal eyes.
Is there anything else you'd like to say on this one? Because this is exactly what we've been looking for in a podcast, isn't it? To really help prepare people and to stand firm, as you say. So is there anything else you want to say?
I would like to say something that has to do with your generations, because your mother and son, and my mother is a very kingdom-minded woman, one of the most kingdom-minded people I know. And I want to tell you a couple of things that she said to me. One is early on, she was allowed to visit me, and I was already starting to break. I was in solitary confinement at the time, and I'm sitting across from her, and I'm just crying, saying, "Look, Mom, I'm crying all the time. I'm just starting to break. I'm so full of grief. I'm just so full of pain in my heart. I don't know if I can handle this." And she says to me, "Well, of course you're crying, Andrew. Of course you have pain. If it weren't difficult, they wouldn't call it suffering. This is what suffering is." And then she said to me, "Andrew, there's a long line of people who've suffered for Jesus Christ. It's a very long line that extends 2,000 years. My son, it is now your turn to stand in that line." And I want to go, "Mom, I'm expecting a little bit of, compassion or something. But, that over time, that stayed in my mind. And just to put things in the right perspective. And this became one of the things I was looking at, that, as she said, that long line that had gone ahead of me. The people like Richard Wurmbrand, since you had mentioned him earlier, or other heroes, other people in the Bible who, suffered, and looking to them as an example. And then at some point I began to realize, and there are going to be people coming in the line behind me. And I need to leave an example for them. I need to leave an example of faithfulness. And so I began to think not only of the examples ahead of me, but of the legacy that I leave, and began to think differently. One of the things that my mother told me also, well, she didn't tell me this, my wife told me this. My mom was in a prayer meeting where people were praying for my deliverance. And she stood up and said, "Stop, we're praying for the wrong thing. Don't pray that Andrew will be delivered." Said, we need to be praying that God will accomplish everything he wants to accomplish for Andrew's imprisonment. And only after he has accomplished these things, and then she gives a list, these are the things I think God wants to accomplish. Only after he accomplishes these things should Andrew be released. And when my mom told Noreen what the list was, Noreen said, "Mom, Andrew's never going to get up. Some of those things are going to happen until heaven." But, the point is the mindset, she's my mother. She loves me. She was not happy that I'm suffering the way I was. But the mentality is there's something so much more important than whether Andrew gets out of prison. And that is what God wants to accomplish that has eternal value, eternal consequences. And so I'm willing for my son to go through hardship so that God will complete what he wants to. Let's not ask for Andrew to get up before that. Because if so, basically I would be leaving without completing what God had. And so that kind of mindset, the one time that my mother really cried was when Noreen called her and said, "Mom, Andrew is suicidal right now. He's at one of his worst points. I don't know, Frank, if he's going to be around in next week." When she was scheduled for a visit, she said, "I don't know the next time that I go if he's there." And my mom started to cry. And it wasn't because she was concerned, Andrew, if he might die and I might not see him again until heaven. It was because she said, "Oh no, if he does this, it will dishonor God and keep God from getting the glory that he wants to receive through this imprisonment." And so really her grief was over the eternal aspect of it rather than my grief. And so that kind of mentality, where we're focused on heaven. And, Jesus focused his disciples on heaven. He talked a lot about it. He encouraged them to invest their time and their lives in heaven. And basically what he was saying is, whatever the cost, count the cost, and whatever the cost is, it really is worth it. And it's very hard for it was very hard for me to think of eternal reward when I have an immediate suffering and I want immediate release. This was one of the other things that helped me to develop that fear of God or right mindset, was to begin to focus more on heaven. And it's very hard to do because I'm living in this world and there are immediate things I'm going through, the pain, the suffering. But I mentioned a song, "I want to be found worthy to stand before you on that day with no regrets from cowardice, things left undone." The next part of it says, "To hear you say, 'Well done, my faithful friend, now enter your reward. Jesus, my joy, you are the prize I'm running for.'" And that just focused me on heaven. I'm living to hear you receive me, that you are my prize. And I'll mention one other thing, since you knew Richard Wurmbrand, is early on in his detention in solitary confinement, he remembered that Jesus gave the command to his disciples that they should rejoice when they are persecuted. And so he decided to dance in his cell. And when I read this in prison, I was convicted, and I thought, yes, I have not been obedient in this area. And I haven't rejoiced. I'm just living under this terrible weight of discouragement and hopelessness and grief. But Jesus commanded, blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil things about you and upon me. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. And so I decided to do what Wurmbrand had done. And so I made a decision. This was my second year as part of my rebuilding process. I'm going to perform an act of obedience every day for 5 minutes. I'm going to dance before the Lord as an act of rejoicing. And so I started to do this, heat, cold, rain, whatever, discouraging days, not whatever. It was like, as a matter of will, I'm going to rejoice. I'm going to rejoice. No, I didn't have any joy, but it was like, I am going to do this. I'm going to be obedient. And I would dance for 5 minutes a day. But when I would get to the point where it says, rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. And I would leap in the air. I would leap and leap. I will leap as David leapt, as Wurmbrand danced. I will dance as Wurmbrand danced. And especially focusing on that, rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. I rejoice and I'm glad because great is my reward in heaven. I was not thinking about reward. I was not motivated by reward. But you know what? As I did that day after day after day, it started to build something in me where I started to say, yes, Jesus is my reward. Jesus is my reward. And it started to motivate me. So these things made me strong over time. And I actually went from that point of terrible brokenness and being dominated by fear. If someone had opened the prison doors the first year, I would have run out. Even if I like to think I wouldn't have run out if God said stay. But fear was so strong. And it took me about a year to get to that point where I could consistently overcome that fear and get to a point of surrender and obedience. But as I did that again and again, it created strength. And I came out of there with a determination to be faithful, and with a fear of God that I still have.
I know that you want to say something before you do. When you were talking,
don't ask me any more questions. I just go on and on and on.
No, we're
you're
loving
good.
it.
No, this is great. You're talking about your mum and her perspective, and she would talk to you. Straight away, I thought is Mordecai. It's like. Yeah. She sounds as comforting as Mordecai was to Esther when Esther says, you realize if I go before the king, that could be the end of it. I could die. And Mordecai's nice, comforting response is being, well, be prepared to die with the rest of your people. It's like, oh, how comforting. That was really nice of you. But that perspective of, look, God's requiring something of you and he's going to get the glory through this. And so you best be willing to do it and walk through this. And so I instantly thought about Mordecai when you were sharing that. I was like, wow, she sounds just like Mordecai. That's the kind of thing that he would have said to Esther if she was in prison and going through all of that stuff.
And so much of what you're saying, Andrew, you know nothing about us, but so much of what you're saying is our heartbeat. We haven't been through what you've been through. We've been in some fairly sticky situations, like we thought we were going to be killed with machetes and things like that, but nothing. These were momentary afflictions. They weren't 2 years of affliction. But, this living with an eternal perspective is what we speak of, especially with raising your children. They focus so much on earthly, the way they're raising them, and not what's going to matter when they stand before the throne. And, I raised Andrew and his siblings from birth, really, to say you will either die for Jesus or you will live a martyred life. That's in their DNA. As you say, I went to bed with Fox's Book of Martyrs as
that was my nighttime reading.
Nighttime reading.
Tell a Wurmbrand story that really touched me.
Yeah.
So Richard Wurmbrand has been released from prison for the final time. And this, you mentioned that you were part of the group that then got him out of Romania. Well, right before he left Romania, he knew he was leaving, that they were kind of selling him to the West.
Yeah.
He gathered children from the church and he took them to the zoo, the lion's cage.
Yeah.
And he said to them, our spiritual ancestors, our spiritual mothers and fathers were fed to the lions. The lions killed them because of their faithfulness to Jesus. Are you willing to suffer for Jesus also? And the children very solemnly nod their heads. They nod their heads, yes. And, I think many people would say, what are you doing, Wurmbrand? This is child abuse. What are you doing? I think, no, children make very serious decisions that can have lifelong fruit. And so one of the things that's especially in my mother's heart is we need to prepare children now so that they will stand in difficult times.
We need to have some conversations, because this is something we are actively engaging in. We'll talk more about that afterwards, maybe. And I think we need to book your mum to come on the podcast, because I'm in love with her already. I think she's a woman after our own hearts. But I think there might be a twist on a Richard Wurmbrand story that you haven't mentioned, so I think maybe you haven't heard. When he had that scripture about dance and great will be reward thereof, do you know what happened the first time he did it?
Yeah, I think they brought him some extra food or something.
Yeah, because they thought he was going mad. I was thinking, did you get the food that came with this thing? But there is so much, Andrew, so much of what you said. It's just like you've just jumped straight into the ocean that we are swimming in. So I want to ask you one other question before we finish, because this clock is ticking over. When Richard came out, I remember going to a church. Well, it was a church hall, and there were young people there, and he was talking to them. And afterwards, he turned to me and he said this. He said, I would rather be back in prison than here. And I said, why? He said, the apathy, the attitude and everything. He said, I would rather be back. Now, he'd only just come out, and you know how horrifically he had suffered. Is there anything, and I'm not just, you don't just give answers like that, so it's a safe question to ask you. Is there anything that you can look back and say, I wouldn't be back there, not if you paid me, I would not be back there. But is there anything you look back and say, but I would have that because I'm not in the West?
I heard something similar from my friend John Arnott, who had spoken with Richard Wurmbrand, and Wurmbrand said to him, sometimes I miss being in solitary confinement, the sweetness I had there with God, and I thought, when I heard that, I thought, this guy's crazy. There's something wrong with him. This was before I went to prison. And one thing, if I remind me to come back to this point, but one of the things that I experienced when I got out of prison is I told you already about just my second year, the battle that I carried on most days to get to a point of submission, of embracing God's purposes, being willing to be in prison for Him, and doing this day after day after day in very desperate situation, intense circumstances, and it builds this strength. And so I am so focused in surrender, serving God's purposes, completing my assignments under pressure, that when I got out, there's a muscle memory, you can say, that kind of when you have when someone's running a marathon, you don't want them to stop and cool down for an hour and then get back into it. It's very difficult. When I came out, I was in full battle mode as far as submission goes. I was strong. And then as time goes on, it's like, I don't want them to send me back. It gets more and more difficult. But I'm still, I just remember the battle mentality. And actually, it's been hard to come down from that and go back into just the easy intimacy. And so maybe, I'm thinking he had just come out. Some of it is he had been battling in prison so much that he still had that muscle memory that was very strong in him. Anyway, that's maybe a sidetrack. But I do miss something from prison, and I don't ever want to go back. It was terrible, and I'm sure I'm very capable of breaking again. But the conditions of my imprisonment, the isolation, the terrible loneliness. So I was the only Christian. The only Christian I had contact with during the 2 years was with my wife when we had visits. So I was very alone in my faith. Just the fear and all those things, the uncertainty. They were really difficult, but they also drove me to run after God. And I have never been so focused on God as I was in prison. And there was an unusual clarity about what most matters, about what's really important. And so these difficulties drove me to run after God, to pursue Him. I spent much of my day just focusing myself on Him and talking to Him, even though He didn't talk back. I never stopped talking to Him. And so there was when I came out, I just don't have the same desperation in running after Him. And I mean, I love Him, but there's no longer, the difficulties there are not there to drive me to cling to Him in desperation, because I was doing that for survival, spiritual survival, emotional survival in every sense. I'm just clinging to Him. I'm saying, I keep my eyes on you like the sunflower from the time that, the sunflower follows the sun from the time it comes up till it goes down. It just changes its position. And I said, I'm going to fix my eyes on you. I want to be like that sunflower. Just follow you from the time I wake up to the time I go to sleep, focused on you, just to survive, and I don't have that driving me anymore. And so this is one of the things that I think when we talk about what is the most important thing that prepares us to stand, we've talked about building eternal perspective and things like that. There are other steps as well. The most important one is building intimacy with God, is running after His heart, and just loving Him. And as I look back, it was the years of pursuing His heart that built the intimacy with Him, so that when I was under pressure and my love was really tested, and it was really tested, it still came through. And I was willing to suffer for the one I love. Now, that's a whole other subject that I can talk about for an hour, but I think it's the most critical thing.
Well, we'll have you back to talk about that for an hour. Before I finish, Andrew, you're not going to be happy with me because I'm going to ask another question. Time's nearly up.
I've got one more question, so make yours a quick one.
Well, okay, I'll give it a go.
Well, can I interrupt and say something I want to say?
Yes.
Which is that when my wife and I were arrested together, she was held for 2 weeks, and I saw that she was doing better than I was. She seemed to be handling it better. We were held in the same cell for 2 weeks. And I think it comes down to, for years, we had been running after God, but I was very sporadic, a lot of zeal, energy, run after Him, and then kind of slack off. And she was just very solid, just day after day after day, prioritizing spending time with God. And she wasn't having all these great revelations or encounters every time she meets with God, but there was a steady building up, accumulation, so that when we're under pressure, then she had a deep reservoir that she was drawing from. And I also had a reservoir, but I think hers was a little deeper. And so what my wife says is, I wasn't prepared, but I wasn't completely unprepared either. And so we can't prepare for every difficulty that's coming, but we don't have to be unprepared either. And the way that we prepare ourselves is that we prepare our hearts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to say.
No, well, now you've booked your wife in for podcasts too. Keep throwing them our way. But I was just thinking, and this doesn't have to go off, that one of the things that I would think would be the battlefield of the mind, especially if you keep thinking about your family outside. Did you that you must have had to have some sort of discipline to not keep entering that outside world and be tortured by the fact that you weren't there? I can imagine for me that would be huge.
Yeah, and it's a mixed thing, because on the one hand, what's really keeping me going is especially with my wife, we're very close to each other, and what's keeping me going really is wanting to see her again and my children again. Otherwise, it's much better to be in heaven than to be in a Turkish prison for the rest of your life. And so, it's the thought of being reunited with her and holding on with that hope that keeps me going. At the same time, I don't want to think about her or remember all of the good things we've had, because it's just very painful. And, even watching a television show or reading something that reminds me of the real world, it's like, wait, I can't have that anymore. And it's very painful. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of conflicting emotions there.
Yeah. We'll finish on this, and I'm sure this could go on for a while as well. But you leave Turkey. There's, at this point, your name, face all over the place, but a lot of people have got involved with trying to help get you out. You leave prison, and I think within 24 hours, you're in the White House meeting with President Trump, praying with him. Going back to the US, that's quite the entry back into America. Did you go through reverse culture shock? How was that going back into America? PTSD. And how long did it sort of take you to start to maybe feel a bit like your old self, to work through some of these things? How was that?
So part of the PTS that I had, part of that is to have a sense of dislocation and of distance from events. So from the time I'm standing in the Turkish court and they convicted me of terrorism and sentenced me to prison, then suddenly released me, from that time on, and then going to the White House, I felt very detached, like there's just, it's happening to someone else.
That's dissociation, yeah?
Yeah, so that's just from something that comes from the post-traumatic stress, from the trauma. As far as healing, I feel like I was so broken the first year, and the second year was horrible. Every day was a real trial. However, I was also going through that rebuilding process, and I came out stronger than I went in, and I came out just really pressing into God. And so there was actually a lot of healing that took place. I had a lot of, one of the things I talk about that we haven't really talked about today is offense toward God, because that's really what almost knocked me out, was the disappointment with God, how I didn't have a sense of presence or strength or all of these different things. And one of the things that helped me to overcome and brought a lot of healing was that the doubts and questions and accusations that were strangling me, I had just a mental picture of a lockbox, and I visualized putting it into that box, my questions, doubts, and accusations, and then locking the box. And I said to God, you and I are the only ones who can open this very securely locked box. And if you want to open it and deal with my questions and doubts and accusations, then go ahead. But I make a decision with my will. I am not going to open this box. I will not give a place in my mind. I will not entertain these doubts and questions any longer. And the key thing, I don't need answers to have a relationship with you. And this kind of broke the strangled hold of the wounded heart, of the offended heart I had toward God. And after that, of course, I'd have doubts and questions, and I'd start to accuse God, and then I'd stop. No, this is going in the box. And as I did that day after day after day, it was a discipline, a mental discipline, spiritual discipline of not going there, of not allowing those things to a place in my mind. And it broke that stranglehold, and I was able to begin to receive truth again. My point is that as I did a number of these things over the second year, there was a lot of healing that came into my heart. God didn't answer my questions, but there was a healing that came in, so that when I came out, there are things I had to work through, but I wasn't curled up on the floor in a fetal position any longer, which I would have been after the first year. And so there was a lot of healing that God took me through as far as in my relationship with Him. So I think that, the adjustment back to states, I say, hey, everything's better than being in prison. So I'm just very happy to be out. I didn't go through any culture shock. I've gone through some. The U.S. has changed a lot, and there's really increasing pressure here, increasing darkness. But I'm so happy to be out. I just enjoy life, and I'm focused on my new assignments. The remainder of the PTS, I had a psychiatrist evaluated me from the U.S. State Department and said to me, well, you have PTS without the D. You have post-traumatic stress, but it's not a disorder in your life. And so, part of that was just sleep, interrupted sleep, struggling with that, which is very normal with PTS, and dreams. I still, every week, depending on what, my circumstances, sometimes it's more intense than other times, but I often end up with nightmares from, like, I'm in prison in Turkey again. And so that's just part of the human cost of the persecution that still goes on.
Wow. Well, there's still so many questions, so many things to explore. Thank you, Andrew, so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. I know we've followed your story from afar, and we're really excited to be able to have you on and have this conversation. So thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it, and look forward to being able to continue the dialogue.
Okay, the Lord bless you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If it inspired you, please rate us and subscribe on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, or another podcast platform.